All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Spring 2024 BERD Seminar Series. So before we start, I wanted to remind you some logistic guidelines, I guess. Just be aware that the Zoom webinar will be recorded, and all participants are muted when you join. So if you have a question, just type in the chat and I will monitor that for you. So if you have registered yourself for the seminar, you will receive a link to the recording as well as the slides with a feedback survey after the seminar. And today we have Dr. Lauren Van Scoy from Penn State. She's a professor of medicine with the Department of Medicine as well as Public Health Sciences. She has expertise in mixed methods and qualitative research, and is also the co-director of Penn State CTSI's Qualitative and Mixed Methods Core. She has several nationally funded active projects and a long list of publications. So thank you, Lauren, for joining us. And also, without any further ado, just take it away. I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to share your screen.
Perfect. All right, just give me 1 second, everyone, to figure out how I'm going to do the share. You're seeing that. So we're going to click and start. And you're seeing my notes right now, correct?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so now
I think that's what you want. No,
you're seeing the regular slide, right? Okay, great. Well, I cannot see your faces. Oh, wait, maybe I know. Do you see the little chat or do you just see my slide?
We just see the slide.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining. I know this is the first time at the new time. So I'm LJ Van Scoy. I'm one of the associate directors at CTSI for Education Workforce Development and one of the co-directors for the KL2 program, and really grateful for working with the BERD program to get the time so that our KL2 scholars can participate. So for those of you that are regulars at the BERD, hopefully our KL2 scholars are going to be joining at this time as well for most of the sessions moving forward. So I'm really excited to be invited back to BERD to talk about mixed methods. And I've done this topic a couple years in a row now. I think I've done this 4 or 5 times. And so what I did this year is I wanted to just add a little spice to it. So we're going to talk a little bit about mixed method surveys in particular, because I think that's a topic that a lot of folks have questions about. And there's a lot of different ways that you can incorporate qualitative into surveys. So the first half of my talk is really going to focus on just mixed method study designs, the very basics of quant and qual, understanding the different types of study designs that are there. Those of you that have heard me talk before, some of this will be review. And then we're going to do a real rapid discussion about what is integration in mixed methods, and just talk very briefly. But I really want to focus the energy on the second part of the talk, where we're going to talk more detailed about how mixed methods can be incorporated into surveys, both in the design of the surveys and in the interpretation and the presentation of the results of your mixed methods surveys. You can feel free to interrupt me. I don't, like I said, I don't see your faces, so just unmute, but don't like wave, just say something, or you can put it in the chat, and I know that they're monitoring for me, so I don't stress if I get interrupted. So by all means, interrupt. All right, so I'm going to start off with the basics of mixed methods. I know many of you here have some overarching idea of what mixed methods is, but I also recognize that there may be some people that don't. So I'm going to sort of go through a few basics, which the first is just talking about what's the difference between the two types of data, quantitative and qualitative. And so you'll hear me refer to quantitative data as quant and qualitative data as qual. And that's sort of how the mixed methods convention is for this. So Quantitative data is what most people are familiar with, which is things that you can count. So beads on this little image that you see here, you can count. They're very discrete numbers, proportions, amounts, those kinds of data. And when we ask questions in quantitative data, quantitative research, we ask the questions about how much. So these are quantitative research questions, often that have goals of proving or disproving various hypotheses that we may have. We have questions where we're trying to examine patterns or causality in quantitative research. And of course, we have a rigorous process that we use that involves our favorite friends, our statisticians and our p-values and all of the things. And our data in the quantitative world can come in many forms, but often comes in social science and health science research. Often comes in the way of questionnaires or scales or blood pressures or pain scores or lab values of those kinds of data. But qualitative data is, of course, different, right? Qualitative data asks different kinds of research questions and has different types of data sets. So in qualitative, our data is no longer discrete numbers or countable things, but rather words, perhaps audio recordings, video recordings, observations. And the reason that qualitative research is so different from quantitative is because of the research questions that we ask. So in qualitative, instead of asking how much or counting or looking for causality, we're asking questions about process and experience and perception. So these questions focus on how or why things may happen. And our questions are more open-ended in nature, so that our goals in qualitative are, again, not about the p-value or about, this is related to that, but rather to generate meaning or understand and contextualize a phenomenon or understand someone's opinion or perceptions about perhaps the complex behavior or task. And so it's important to remember that qualitative research is equally useful as quantitative research, and it's equally rigorous in that instead of using statistics, we have a process that we apply to our written data or our visual data, depending on what kind of study we're doing, where we generate descriptive themes and conceptual models, depending on the kind of analysis that you're doing, but that it's not just sort of looking at the words and summarizing what people say, that there's actually a process to qualitative data. And that process is a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to talk today about, but it's important to know that it's not just sort of cherry picking quotations from people. And in qualitative, our data usually comes in the form of interviews, whether those are one-on-one or focus groups. We can look at blog entries, we can look at art pieces, really anything that can help us to generate meaning and answer these kinds of research questions. And so in mixed methods, the reason that I love mixed methods so much is that it gives you sort of the best of both worlds. And so integrating these two different kinds of data sets allows you to arrive at a new conclusion. So if you're collecting numbers and asking how much, and then you're also collecting words and answers and asking how or why, when you put them together or mix them, you can come up with new ideas or conclusions that you would not have gotten to had you not touched those data sets together. And I use these rainbow images a lot in the talks that I do, and it's because I love the metaphor or the analogy of using color as data. So if you're imagining in mixed methods that you have two different kinds of data, you have qualitative data that perhaps is yellow, and you have quantitative data that perhaps is green. If you have them separated, you'll have yellow and you'll have green. But if you mix them together, you're going to generate blue. You're going to see the blue color, which you never would see if you kept them in separate siloed containers. And so it's that mixing that is the most important part of qualitative and mixed methods. And so when we do our mixing, which is called integration in mixed methods, we have lots of different things that we can accomplish. So we might combine the lessons learned from the qualitative and the quantitative data sets to mix them together into a new color, right, blue. Or you could use one data set to inform or explain the findings of the other, or increase the validity. If you have this data tell the story from a quantitative perspective and then have data that tells a similar story from a qualitative perspective, then that gives more validity and strength to conclusions in your research. And so the integration process, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail in this talk, is really that key, that mixing of the colors, the yellow and the green coming together to form blue. At Michigan, they don't use colors. They like to say 1 + 1 = 3, as a way to explain how integration generates that new idea that you wouldn't get by itself. And what mixed methods is not is really important, right? So it's really important to know that mixed methods is not simply getting some qualitative data, getting some quantitative data, and then publishing them in the same paper. That is not mixed methods. That's not invaluable. That's not valuable, but that is called multi-method. It's only when you report the two together and mix the two. So you need to make sure you have these little umbrella men going across your data set. That's what really makes something mixed methods. So you'll see that without the integration, without the mixing of the color or the umbrella men going between the silos, you're going to have multi-method research, which is fine, but you shouldn't be calling that mixed methods. It's only when you touch the two data sets together that you have true, like pure mixed methods, and we'll talk about that. So the problem with mixed methods is that it's a lot, and it's twice the work. And I almost always, I should say always actually, design my studies to have mixed methods these days. And the reason is that I find quantitative questionnaires, which is a big bulk of a lot of the work that we do in our research, is really useful. But quantitative questionnaires, they just give you, mean score of, on a scale from 1 to 10, mean score of 7. That's great, but I know it's a 7, but I'm not going to get some context and nuance that I might want in order to draw conclusions from my questionnaires. And qualitative interviews are great because they capture that nuance, but you can't do 1,000 qualitative interviews because it's just too labor intensive. And we need much, much smaller sample sizes in qualitative data to capture that nuance and context and depth. And this is especially relevant in interventional trials where you really want to sort of mix together the need for these comprehensive, big study, well-powered trials, but also have these nuanced conclusions and measures that you get from qualitative. And so that's where I really find mixed methods can help us in that it allows us to sort of capture the best of both worlds. And like I said before, it can add validity and credibility to findings that you would have in your studies. So I want to move on to the 3 types of designs. There are 3 main types of mixed methods designs. If you're interested in reading about this, I really recommend John Creswell's work. He has published a bunch of research methods. The research design, I think I have it at the end of this talk. The cover of that book is what we used to teach is what I used to teach in the mixed methods course, and really follows along with this language quite well. So exploratory sequential, explanatory sequential, and convergent are the 3 types of study designs. And I'm just going to show you an image and talk really briefly about each of these 3, because like I said, I really want to focus on surveys and how these designs fit into surveys. But first, I need to give you an overview of what the designs are. So exploratory sequential designs are research studies that have mixed methods, meaning they have qualitative data and quantitative data. And the 2 data sets are collected and analyzed sequentially. So you're not doing them at the same time, but you're doing exploratory, you'll do 1 data set and then analyze it, and then collect your 2nd data set and analyze it and come up with your final results. And in exploratory sequential designs, we usually ask questions, or we usually use qualitative research to help us inform or build into a larger quantitative study. Or it could be that you're using qualitative to build into a larger mixed method study or an interventional study. So these are the kinds of studies where you might be interested in learning perceptions of people's opinions about an intervention that you plan to test, or you may be trying to figure out information that can help to design a new survey that you want to measure, or a preliminary ideas about the impact of a program, that kind of thing. And so qualitative focus groups are often used in this setting where you do your focus groups, you do your analysis of your focus groups, you get your results, you get your themes, you learn what you're going to learn from the people in your focus groups or in your interviews. And then you use that to actually inform or build into your quantitative data, meaning that you don't just sort of publish that and move on, but the results from the qualitative focus groups actually touch or impact the way that you're going to do your quantitative study. So that may be that those qualitative results directly build into your quantitative survey, or it may be that those qualitative results help you adapt your intervention and change it, and then you later quantitatively measure that. So that in the second phase of your study, you're using the lessons from your qualitative to conduct your quantitative study. And sometimes it's a mixed method. Second phase can be mixed methods too. And that's what's going to sort of test or apply the knowledge that you learned in phase one. And that's what gives you your final results. So it's a stepwise process that takes a little bit longer because you have to sort of do your qual and then, make your changes or your modifications or build your survey and then do your quant, and then you get the result of your study. I already sort of talked about those two examples. Explanatory sequential is sort of the opposite. And while you can certainly have explanatory studies that have qualitative go first and then quantitative, it's really the intent of the study that comes up with the name. And in general, 99% of the time, explanatory studies start with a quantitative data set, then you go down into your qualitative, whereas exploratory is the way that we just talked about. So it doesn't have to be in that order. But in general, that's how it goes. So for explanatory sequential, you usually start with a quantitative study. So maybe it's a big survey or something where you got the opinions of someone, or you identify a health problem, or maybe you do a clinical trial, a big quantitative clinical trial, and the results aren't as you expect. And you analyze them and you come up with your findings and you're like, I have like new questions, right? Or I don't understand why this didn't work the way that I thought it was going to work, or my attrition was really high in this research project and I don't understand why people didn't finish the intervention, why they were lost to follow-up. And so you might design a secondary phase, which is qualitative, to explain the results from the first phase of the study. So these are things that are sort of predetermined, that you're going to do a quantitative survey, and then once you get the results, you're going to use those results to generate new qualitative questions that you can then link back, connect to your initial phase one. And so that process of integration is called explaining or connecting, and that's what ultimately results in your final results. So it's almost the opposite. Exploratory sequential, coming back to this one, the intent of this design is to explore, to figure something out, to start big and broad and explore whatever your research question is, to build down into your quantitative. But in explanatory sequential, you're not exploring, you have a finding, you have a big thing, and you're trying to explain, right? And so that's the intent. And so again, it doesn't have to be quant then qual. It's more about the intent of your research question that defines the kind of study design that you're using. Any questions on those two before I move to the third one? Okay. All right. And we're going to come back and I'm going to show some examples of some of these, but the third and final one is the convergent design. And the convergent design is different from the sequential designs in that you're collecting your qualitative and your quantitative data at the same time, or at least close together in time. So it's not sequential. It's not that you collect one data set and then analyze it and then move to your next data set. No, instead, you're doing a qualitative analysis, you're doing a quantitative analysis, you get the results of those analyses separately, and then what you do is something called merging or comparing and contrasting, where you integrate those findings, you put them together, do your compare and contrast, find the similarities, find the differences, and then that's what generates your final result. And I'm going to show you examples of how we build these kinds of study designs, and this is very commonly used in survey research. And so that's what's going to lead us off into section 2. But the convergent design is something that does not have to occur sequentially, unlike the study designs that we talked about before. And this one is really powerful in that it allows you to sort of learn the results of your study qualitatively, and then learn the results of your study quantitatively, and then see where there are agreements or disagreements, or convergence or divergence, right? Where they converge and agree, then you're like, great, my data is really valid because I collected it 2 different ways and I got the same story. Or it could be that the quantitative data tells you something different than the qualitative data, and that helps you to generate new hypotheses and sort of go into problem solving mode and say, well, why is this not as I'm expecting? And oftentimes that can result in some of the most interesting pathways to your research. So an example of this would be if you interview people about a certain research topic and you also give them a questionnaire about that same topic, and then you compare and contrast the way they answered their interview questions with the way that they answered their questionnaires would be one example. So, and I did already chat on this about the benefits of convergence. Obviously, it adds credibility and validity. But when things don't fit together, all is not lost, because you can expand on your ideas, you can troubleshoot, you can get new ideas from when you have divergent data. And oftentimes what we find when we have divergence in our data is that one of the data sets maybe isn't as good as you thought. Maybe the survey wasn't as good as we thought. Or if you do some further digging into the literature, you might find that this is something that other folks have found before, and you're adding to the literature in that way. Or it might, like I said, challenge the validity of the constructs. Maybe your hypothesis was wrong, or the way that you're measuring your hypothesis was wrong. And so it allows you to sort of figure out, well, why was it wrong? And so sort of thinking about how you will handle convergent and divergent data, like when you're designing your study, is really important to do in advance, because you don't want to just sort of be wishy-washy, right? You want to say, okay, in the event that my qualitative data tells a different story than my quantitative data, I will rely more heavily on the qualitative data because my research question is really more of a qualitative one than it is a quantitative one, or vice versa. Or it could be, say, okay, if my data diverges, I'm going to rely more on my quantitative sample than I am on my qualitative sample, because my quantitative sample covers 1,500 people and my qualitative data is really only interviewing 30 people. So that may be a reason why you would prioritize one over the other. It's really important when you're designing convergent studies that you say this in advance. And I usually, just to cover myself and keep myself honest, I usually put this in my IRB to say, okay, in the event of divergence, here's what I'm going to do. So that way, if a reviewer ever comes back to you and says, oh, you can't just like disregard the one story that you didn't like, then you say, no, this was the plan all along, and here's my IRB to show you that. So that's just a note about rigor. All right, questions about that? So what I'm going to do now is go into the ways that we can put all of our data and our colors together and to make new shapes and patterns, which is what's, I think, the most fun thing about mixed methods. So mixed methods has two different ways that we can mix. You can mix in or integrate in the study design. So this would be called methodologic integration. And that is when you are in the process of writing your grant, or you're beginning to put your study together. It's before you get to the analysis piece. And the way that we integrate is through stuff I've already talked about, but we'll talk about again in a moment, called connecting, building, merging, or embedding. And then the second part of integration can happen at the level of interpretation or reporting, which is after you've done all of your analyses, you're sitting with your findings and you're kind of trying to put them together and make a shape or a structure or a sculpture or a story or a results section, right? To tell the story of what you learned and how you're going to mix those together. And when you do that after you've analyzed the data, that is called integration at the level of interpretation. So you can do it in the study design, you can do it in the interpretation, and oftentimes we end up doing it across both. So you have both methodologic and interpretive integration. So at the methods level, the way that you integrate is the way that you design your study. And so like we talked about for the qualitative, the exploratory sequential study design, where you have your qualitative data that builds into your quantitative intervention or survey. That's one type of methodologic integration, building, versus connecting, which was what we talked about in explanatory sequential, where you take your qualitative results and link it backwards to explain your quantitative results. And that's that study design is called connecting or explaining. And in convergent, we call it merging or matching. So I'm going to talk about each of those quickly. All right, so matching or merging is when you bring the two data sets actually together, and you're sort of like zipping them up, you're putting them next to each other, and you're looking to see where are they similar, where are they different, how do they fit together. So in this case, when you're designing your study, it's really important that you design constructs that are going to fit together. So if you have one measurement that's all about, I don't know, food, and another measurement that's all about exercise, how are you going to put those together? They're not going to match up, right? You're not going to be able to draw conclusions about food and exercise because they're two different constructs. So we're going to talk about that in survey design and how it's important to match those constructs so that when you get to your results, you can merge them together. And so that whole process of making sure that your constructs match is a methodologic integration called matching. For connecting, there are different ways that you can do this. And this is, of course, the idea of you do your quantitative survey. Maybe you get 500 people that answer a survey, and you have all of these people that loved the thing and all of these people that hated the thing. And you kind of want to understand, why was there such differences? So what you can do is you can do sampling of interviews to interview maybe the 15 people that loved the thing, and then interview 15 people that hated the thing, right? And then that will help you to connect their qualitative results with the quantitative survey answers for the sample. And so when you do this, this is called sampling or connecting, by choosing the sample based on how they responded to your quantitative survey. And so you can do this in real time in a survey itself, or you can do it after you've analyzed your data. And I'm going to show you examples. Or you could look to interview typical cases, or you could look to interview outlier cases. If there's something that makes no sense and you want to understand it better, why they responded in a different way than everybody else, that can tell you a lot as well. And so when you design your study, you can make these study design choices up front and say, I'm going to interview, people that had, standard deviations outside the norm. And that's how I'm going to connect my findings. So it's all in the study design that you're doing that. Building is the one for exploratory sequential. And building is when you take one data set, usually qualitative, you analyze it, you get your themes or you get your quotes, and then you turn it into something that you use in your second phase. So you might be designing a survey. And so the themes that you get from your qualitative data may be all about acceptability of an intervention. And then you can use those themes about acceptability to design survey items or scales. And you may use actual quotes that can help to build individual survey items based on the data. So there's different ways that you can build, but you can see how the qualitative data impacts the way that you collect the quantitative. And that's called building, and that's a methodologic study design. Does that make sense for everybody? It's hard for me to assess understanding here. All right. The final thing I want to touch on about our overview of mixed methods is into integration after you've analyzed your data. So at the level of interpretation, I just talked about the ways that you can design mixed methods in study design. And now I want to talk very briefly about joint displays, which is the way that you can present your integrated findings in your papers. So this image that you see here on the right is like my favorite way to explain what a joint display is. And it's like the perfect joint display, even though it's a toy. But it's essentially, by looking at that image, you can tell immediately the way that there's three data sets, right? The first, the round, the hexagon, and the square. There's three different data sets. And I can see immediately from this image, imagine it was a table with three columns. You can see the ways that the data are similar, and you can see the ways that the data are different. And that's like immediately apparent. So I can see where they converge and I can see where they diverge. And that's essentially the sign of a good joint display. So it's allowing you to compile your data in a way that facilitates comparisons. And in general, you can do this with tables, where you have table one with your qualitative findings, table two that has the results from your qualitative findings. I forget which I said first. And then the third column, you might say, the stories were similar or different. And then the fourth column, you have your interpretation or your conclusion. And this is often useful for survey research studies I'll show you the examples of those as well. All right, so now that we have like kind of an overview and a common language, now I'm going to kind of dive into the details. So if I've confused you from going too fast, I apologize, but I promise you it will become more clear when we go through the examples as they relate to survey research. So choosing a core design is equally applicable to when you're doing surveys. Most folks think that you can do survey research, you're always going to have to do a convergent approach, right? Because you're collecting the qualitative and the quantitative at the same point in time in a single survey. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Remember, I said that it's all about the intent of your research questions. So all three designs can be applied to survey research, and I'm going to show you an example of each. The easiest way to incorporate qualitative research into surveys, of course, is by just adding open-ended questions, but they have to be designed really, really carefully and really well. And there's pros and cons to putting qualitative data into surveys. The pros, of course, is that it's easy. You don't have to do transcription because it's usually typed right in. It's a lot faster. But the downside is that people will type less. They will talk to you more. They'll give you more meat and potatoes and talk more. And you can sort of have a back and forth dialogue if you're doing interviews versus in a survey, it's like they write what they write and then you're done. So they may write a one-word answer and that's not going to help you very much. So that's why writing your research questions is really important. And then also being very, very specific about the type of study design that you're using in your survey, whether it's convergent or explanatory or something else, and thinking through in advance how you're going to touch these things together so that you avoid that problem of having a bunch of questions about food and a bunch of questions about exercise, and then they don't really like relate to each other so that you can't really mix them together. So that's sort of what we're gonna work on next. So when you're trying to make these decisions, well, what kind of survey, what study design, it's really easy to start with the research question. So I want to make this a little interactive. And so I'd like you guys to just put in the chat, based on what you know about qualitative and quantitative research, if you were looking to research what are the barriers to vaccination, would that be more of a quantitative question or a qualitative question? Just throw it in the chat. Qual. Okay, qual. Okay, good. Everyone's got it. Yes, that's a qualitative question, right? Because we're trying to figure out an experience, like why, right? Why are you not getting vaccinated? What about something like knowledge about advanced care planning? Would that be a quantitative question or a qualitative question? Quantitative, qualitative, quantitative. Both. Yeah, could be both. Either, probably qual first, then quant. Depends. Okay, good. Yeah, so we'll talk about that. There's different ways you can measure knowledge. I tend to think of knowledge as sort of like testable. You get an A or you get a B, hopefully. So I tend to think of knowledge as facts or truth. So that to me is more quantitative, but there are ways that you can measure knowledge, of course, qualitatively as well. So nobody's wrong there. What about satisfaction with care? Would that be a qualitative question or a quantitative question? Or both? Quantitative, both, quantitative, both. Both, could be both. Yeah. Okay, good. So yeah, I mean, it certainly could be both. And we're gonna, right, exactly. Like Sarah says, it could be both, like rate your care and then explain why. Yep. And since you guys are crushing this in the answers, acceptability of an intervention. What do you guys think? Qualitative, quantitative, or both? You see, Emily says both. Okay. All right, good. All right. So let's go through some of these. Let's go through ways to measure. So what we're going to do here is we're looking at our constructs. So I'm talking about convergent research at this point. So this is the type of study design where if you're designing a survey, survey on barriers to vaccination, and you want to use a convergent approach, you want to say, okay, what are the two different lenses? What are the tools that I have in my toolbox to measure barriers to vaccination? So qualitatively, you could ask an open-ended question in a survey. What prevents you from obtaining your flu shot? Right? That's a qualitative approach. It's a what question, but it's what prevents you. So they should answer in prose. It's not a yes, no, it's not a how much. It's what are the things that prevent you from getting your shot? Or why did you decide to get or not get? That gets at a little more process, right? So depending on what your research question is, you might ask either or both of these in an open-ended survey. And if you were to look at this quantitatively, you might say, okay, well, I know from the literature that these are the 5 things that people say, because there's, trust me, a lot of literature out there on barriers to vaccination. So it's not clear that you would need to go back to basics with qualitative. If you're just trying to figure out what's the problem in my population, it's very possible that a quantitative approach would be the way to go there, because you could figure out what's of the very well-known barriers that exist to vaccination, which are the ones that are most salient in my population. So either of these approaches are just fine. And again, it depends if you wanted to have people check off, select all that apply. This is not them putting in words. This is them checking off, and then you could say, 90% of the folks had concern about vaccine safety, and 80% had concern about getting sick from the vaccine, those kinds of things. So it really depends on what's known about the research topic and what you want to get out of your research. So let's think about ways to measure knowledge, right? So again, someone said both about knowledge, and I totally agree. It can be both. So you might ask someone, please describe your understanding of what it means to complete advanced care planning. And this is my area of research, right? Advanced care planning is like thinking about your end of life wishes and completing advanced directives. And so the problem with this approach for me in my field, right, if I'm trying to get knowledge about advanced care planning, is that a lot of folks don't know what advanced care planning is. They have knowledge about it, but they can't really explain it, right? They may be able to answer some true or false questions, but to describe what it means to complete the process is something that is hard for many lay people to put into words. So this may not be the best approach to knowledge in advanced care planning, but you might say something else like, tell me what you know about, blood pressure medications, right? Again, you're going to get like a wide variety of things in knowledge. So you just have to be really specific in the way that you ask your knowledge questions qualitatively, but that may be something you want to do for your research question. Or maybe you want to understand how 12th graders understand, genetics and science, and you want to do a qualitative analysis of all their essays or something, and you might pull their knowledge out of their essays. So you certainly can do it. For me, I generally tend to go with knowledge looking at, tests. So true or false, multiple choice, those kinds of things. All right, so that's just sort of an example of how you choose and how like some questions are better suited for one level of inquiry over the other, but you can almost always ask things in either language, so to speak. So for convergent designs, if you're designing a survey study and you want to ask the questions both quantitatively and qualitatively, or you want to do a convergent study where you're going to use matching, you just want to be really careful that you're measuring up, that you have some questions on your survey that ask it quantitatively and some questions on your survey that ask it qualitatively. So that way, when you are putting it all together, you have answers for all of the quadrants, right? So satisfaction with care, a lot of you already said both, which is, I think, absolutely correct. On a scale from 1 to 10, how satisfied were you with your last healthcare visit? That gives me great information. If everyone's at 90%, I'm great. But what if everyone's at 60% or 70%? I don't really know how to interpret that. So that's where my qualitative might be really helpful to include in my survey, asking the exact same question, what are your thoughts about your last visit? That's also getting at this construct of satisfaction with care, but it's getting at it through a different lens. And so when you put those two together, you're going to have really valuable information. And similarly with acceptability, this is the Net Promoter Score. This is a very common way to assess acceptability of something. How likely are you to recommend the thing to a friend or family? Or you could ask qualitatively, what are your thoughts about the thing or the intervention, right? And so again, it's this matching, right? Making sure that you have a qualitative and a quantitative measurement for each construct, each thing that you're trying to ask about in your research. So that's what it looks like in methodologic mapping, right? This is before you get to your results. This is just your measures. But what does it look like in your paper? And this is what a convergent joint display might look like. And I think I took it out for time, but if you look up, if you're interested in looking at some convergent joint displays, you can just, I've published quite a few of them. It usually says convergent in the study design. Or you can look in the Creswell text that has a lot of examples, or just Google convergent designs in the literature in your field and take a look to see how people publish this. But again, this is sort of the example here is you have the construct, the satisfaction with care, and then the result, right? 80% of people rated their healthcare experience as excellent. So it could be that, you had a survey of 100 different satisfaction items, but you want to sum it up in a joint display. A joint display is all about, remember that picture of the toy, right? Where you can like see really easily where they're similar, where they're different. You want to just have it summative. This is not presenting all of your quantitative results. This is presenting like the kicker, like the ultimate answer or the thing that's most important for your conclusions. So 80% of people said that their healthcare experience was excellent. And qualitatively, I learned that participants noted that their visit went smoothly overall and that the clinician provided good information and they had their questions answered. So they were satisfied because it went smoothly, they got good information, their questions were answered. So now I have both the reasons and the numbers. Similarly, you might have here acceptability of an intervention. 90% were likely or very likely to recommend it, and they found it helpful, useful, and it increased their knowledge, right? So that those may be things that you said. And so that's how you would present this in a table in a manuscript. And then in your conclusion, you would just sort of sum it up and say, like, overall, people were satisfied and thought it was acceptable, and you move on. So that's using convergent designs. Another way that you can use mixed methods in surveys is to use what I call anyway, the explanatory variant approach. So here, you're not trying to tell the same story with two different measures, right? You're not matching, but instead here you're trying to do connection, right? You're trying to explain. So the intent of the qualitative follow-up question in the survey is to explain the findings from the quantitative. So this gives you a little bit more of a detailed understanding about why they're picking, on a scale from 1 to 10, you picked a 9. Why did you pick a 9? Explain to me why you picked a 9, right? It's not asking the same question. It's saying, why did you pick what you picked? And that's the intent of the research is a little bit different. And you can do this using branching logic in, survey tools like REDCap. And again, it's often a little bit tricky because you just have to be careful in surveys. You're really dependent on how much people are willing to type. So here's our same set of constructs using an explanatory variant. And I want you to notice the difference from the way that we design this study from the way that we design the convergent study. My email is blowing up. That's why I keep looking at my watch, y'all. I don't know what's going on. Okay, satisfaction with healthcare providers. So on a scale from 1 to 10, it's that same quantitative question. How satisfied were you with your last healthcare visit? So here, it could be that you ask questions about their answers. So what went well and what could have been improved. And so you can branch it out. So if someone, answers 9 out of 10, you can say, well, what went well? Or if someone answers, 1 to 4, what could have been improved? Or you could ask those questions of everybody and sort of try to relate them to the way that they answer the questions. For this one, acceptability, how likely are you to recommend the intervention? This may have popped up. You can have a pop-up here that says, you said you rated that you were very likely to recommend this. Why? What is it about the intervention? And so this is more of an explanatory variant than the convergent variant where you're asking, again, that same question in 2 different ways. This one is more about explanation for the answers. And so what I like about this design is that it gives you a better you're not just telling the same thing twice. Your conclusions are a little more nuanced. So for example, in the satisfaction, we still learned that 80% said their healthcare experience was excellent. But we might be able to say that overall people were more satisfied with the clinical things, but that the minority of people, those that answered 1, 2, and 3, they answered that way because of issues with the clinic logistics, the workflow, the wait times. So that will help you to understand that the dissatisfaction was more related to logistical things and not necessarily the clinical care. And you might have missed that if you hadn't done the analysis looking at the extremes, if you had just done a convergent design. For acceptability, 90% are likely or very likely to recommend the intervention. Here, your qualitative data may say that participants were likely to recommend it to family and friend because they thought it would help them get new information or new knowledge, and because the intervention had an engaging format. But some felt that the intervention was applicable for their loved ones, or that it was not, sorry, there's a typo, did not feel the intervention was applicable for their loved ones, or that their loved ones already knew the information. So now you're learning, okay, if people say, I'm not going to recommend it, it's not because they didn't like it. It's because they said, oh, my loved one already knows that, right? So it's a different reason than what you might assume. I see a question here.
No, yeah.
So Heather's saying, LJ, as you were talking, I wondered if you add qualitative open-ended questions to a validated survey, does that change the validio? No, it doesn't change the validio because I don't know what that is. The validity. It's something that recently came up for me and I don't know. I would say no, but the qual-ended may influence how they answer, which would be a yes. So it's a hard question. That's a really good question, Heather. I would say I agree with you. It depends on how you ask it and when. I agree. I would put the qualitative at the end after they've done the validated part. I probably, if you're going to do it in the middle of the survey, then yeah, I think it does change the validity, but not a whole lot. So you can just say we adapted it. We adapted it by adding qualitative questions throughout the course of the survey. And then like the reader can decide whether or not it's valid or not. I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. It just came up and I wanted another expert to, help me think through that one.
Yeah. I mean, of course it changes the validity, right? But does it change it substantially? I don't think so, but
no, I don't think so either.
I don't think so, but I would probably mention as in the methods that it was adapted.
Perfect.
Okay. I just have 2 more slides. Okay, I'm good on time. So I think I've got 2 or 3 more slides for you guys. This is another example of a joint display using an explanatory analysis variant. So in this paper, I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah. So this is a little bit different than what we talked about. So this was, we asked some open-ended questions about what are your thoughts about COVID? And then we asked them questions about how likely or unlikely are you to get vaccinated? And those are not matched constructs, right? What are your thoughts about COVID and how likely are you or not likely are you to get vaccinated? Those aren't matched. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to learn, did people that are likely to get vaccinated, do they have different thoughts than the people that are unlikely to get vaccinated about COVID? So we did a qualitative analysis of the whole data set, and then we sorted the results, the codes, based on how likely they were to get vaccinated and how likely they were to not get vaccinated. And then we developed themes within each of those groups. So it was almost like a subgroup analysis based on how they did their quantitative responses. So it wasn't a branching logic question. It wasn't anything like that. We matched it at the level of the interpretation. So, and I have to remind myself of the data, but the theme here, politicization of the pandemic by the government was overly influencing in the vaccine development process. So a lot of people felt that politics were influencing vaccine development. And so when you looked at the folks who were likely or unlikely to get vaccinated, you could see that their responses were a little bit different, right? In that the people that thought this, those that were likely to get vaccinated, their comments were mostly about the Trump administration versus the people that weren't likely were more general about government, politics, rushing, that kind of thing. So there were definitely differences in the way that people responded. And you can kind of read this down, you know, these codes were equally common across the two groups, that kind of thing. So it just gives you another way to look at the data using this explanatory sequential method. The last thing I just want to mention in survey research is that you can also use a pure explanatory sequential approach. Right? So you may want to conduct a big survey of like 1,000 people about, you know, health behavior related to diabetes, right? And you have, you know, 50 questions in your survey and it's all quantitative. Maybe you throw in a qualitative question, maybe not, whatever, but you do a quantitative survey. You still can do explanatory sequential mixed methods because all you have to do in the end, and think about this up front, is would you be willing to complete a follow-up interview, right? So if you put that question in there and then you get their name and their contact information, then this can be really helpful because after you've analyzed your results, you're like, oh my gosh, I don't understand this. I wish I could talk to these people, or I wish I could talk to those people. Well, now you can, because they've sort of given consent to be followed up with, and you can now do a follow-up explanatory interview. And this is, of course, more time intense because you have to do your survey and then you have to analyze it and then you have to figure out who you want to talk to and then you have to call them. But you can get really, really in-depth results, which is, I think, a big advantage to the survey open-ended questions where you're at the whim of however lazy they are in typing. But if you call them up on the phone, give them an extra $15 gift card or $20 gift card, now all of a sudden you can talk to them on the phone for 20 minutes and really get in there and probe and understand things. So this explanatory approach can be very pure without having to do all that branching logic and sorting and all that. You just want to make sure that in your survey, you always want to ask them, would you be willing to complete a follow-up interview? So, and again, the advantage there is that you get the depth of an interview versus, you know, the thing. So, and you can use purposive sampling again to pick who you want to talk to. Okay, so the last thing, this is my final slide, was to just show an example of how exploratory sequential approaches can be used in survey research. And so the way that, you know, I showed you guys this slide earlier when we talked about building, how you can get the themes or the quotes from an analysis, maybe some focus groups, and then use those to build a survey. And so I just wanted to give you an example of that to sort of drive it home a little. And you can see over here, you know, you all know that, well, many of you know that I do research on end-of-life communication, quality of death and dying in the ICU, a very uplifting topic. But one of the things that I really love about the way that we measure the quality of death and dying is that it was actually done using exploratory sequential work. And so what happened was back in the 90s, when this became a construct of interest, they started to do qualitative interviews with folks about, you know, well, what does a good death look like in the ICU? And they asked family members and they asked nurses and they asked physicians. And these were the things that kind of came up in the qualitative interviews. They said, you know, oh, I think a good death is someone who has their pain under control, or got a lot of support from a religious leader, or they, you know, didn't die in the ICU. They actually went home before they died. That's what, to me, made their quality of death and dying good. And so you can imagine how this related really well into a survey. And so now the QODD survey literally is just these items on a scale from 1 to 5 about how much do you agree that your loved one had this experience, or I forget how it's worded, but it really, it was derived out of those qualitative interviews. And so while it's not really a survey, it's qualitative following up by a survey, but having that survey designed by qualitative is an example of an exploratory sequential approach. So with that, I'm going to stop my slides, and I see a bunch of questions in the, well, I see 2 questions in the chat, and I will try to answer them. So the first one from, well, Heather's, we got Sarah. What do you do when you ask for volunteers for the follow-up interview and then only 20% of people who said they were interested actually interview? So yeah, that's selection bias, and that's going to happen. Is, you know, Generally, you want to try to follow up with them as soon as possible after they agree, to try to avoid attrition, but it's just like any other loss to follow up. It's just going to be a selection bias that you note in the limitation of your paper. And similarly, like if you have, let's say that you do 100 surveys and 80 people said that they'd be willing to participate in a follow-up survey. Well, what about those other 20 people? Like that, there's clearly a selection bias just in those 80%. And then there's another selection bias in the people that actually picked up the phone. So you just have to acknowledge that. And I don't know if others have thoughts or ideas on how to address that, but I think that's just sort of part of business in research. And other people can feel free to jump in, by the way. This isn't, discussion at this point. Lena's asking, how important is the sample size in qualitative studies? How do you compare focus group samples versus population surveys? How do you compare the power based on the sample size? So that's like a huge question I can't answer in like 3 minutes, but essentially sample size in qualitative research is really dependent on the research question. So for example, if you're asking, people, what did you think about COVID? In general, you're going to get two kinds of responses. You're going to get people that thought it was like the worst thing ever. And you're going to get people that were like, oh, it wasn't a big deal. It was fake, right? I mean, you're going to get variance in between, but those are going to be the two buckets of people. And so if you're looking to reach data saturation, the point where you don't need to keep asking people over and over because you're going to keep getting the same answers, that question, probably you're going to get people that thought it was the worst thing ever, people that thought it was like no big deal. And so maybe you need to ask 10, 15 people and you'll start to see those two buckets fall out and then you're done. But if you ask someone, how did COVID affect your family? You're going to get more than two buckets, right? You're probably going to get people that had children, people that were working, people that were teachers, people, like you're going to have a whole range. And so you're probably going to need to sample more people based on your research question. And so that's how sample size is determined in qualitative research. And so it's something that needs to be just thought about intentionally and is part of sort of qualitative research in general. Other questions? And Lena, I know there was a bunch of other questions in there, like, sample size and power. There is no power in qualitative research. It's not hypothesis testing, so you don't have power analysis.
Lauren, I have a quick question that at least I think it's a quick question, but I don't know. So for the qualitative research, is there any, like, when you were talking about it, I mean, I know that you didn't want to talk about the process that much, but a question that was in my mind is that, let's say I ask 100 people about something, why, right? And they give me this they describe things maybe in an interview or something. How do I figure out these are the key components in that entire description that they give me to be that is related to my research? And the second part of that is, is there any machine learning type of things that are being used now for this type of research?
Yeah, great questions. So the qualitative analysis is a process where you read all of it, you come up with like codes, so like little blurbs of, here this person's talking about diet and this person's talking about exercise and this person's talking about this and that, and you come up with all these codes, and your analysts create what's called a code book, and then you apply that code book into the data set, and then you compare and contrast, and it's sort of a lengthy process. I know Dr. Stuckey gives some talks for BERD on qualitative process, and I think she covers like what is coding and how do you do coding, that sort of thing. For the machine learning, that's a really good question. I have used machine learning or natural language processing for qualitative analyses, particularly when you have huge data sets. And there's some real advantages to that, in that you can find buzzwords really quickly. You can do like sentiment analyses where you get like positive sentiments and negative sentiments and, those kinds of analyses. The downside to those is that it really just sort of groups things together. It doesn't interpret anything for you. It'll just say like 90% of people said positive things, but if you go in and you actually read it, it's not necessarily right. And so you lose a little bit of that human element. But when you have 50,000 blogs or Facebook entries or something, it's the best way to do it. And then you can have humans go in and do smaller subsamples and use the machine learning for that. So an AI also can be useful. There's really a lot of debate in that area. I think that it also depends on the discipline and the sample size. You know, if you're going to have 20 interviews, you're not going to use machine learning. If you're going to have 20,000 blogs, you're going to need to use machine learning.
Good, thank you. I think there's a quick question about the reference that you mentioned.
Yeah, so it's John Creswell, Research Design, ERG. I thought I had the book at the end. It's, if you just Google John Creswell Research Design, I think it's the, but Andy, does anyone, Heather, do you have it, or I can Google it real quick. Sorry. Qualitative Inquiry and Research Design. Yeah, that's it. Yep. Or he also has one called Mixed Methods Research Design. Either of those, depending on what you're looking for.
All right, we quickly ran out of time. All right, thank you very much, Lauren. We appreciate you joining us this time as well. And as a reminder, everyone will get, if you're a registered participant, everyone will get a link to Lauren's talk as well as to her slides. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.